Hello students and welcome to our presentation on the Freedom Riders. Today's video will be focusing on the Aboriginal Freedom Riders, and I want this to be your heading in your books for your notes. As I go through the presentation, I want you to write down all the notes that are on the slides and also pay attention to anything I have to say in addition to those notes. But the minimum expectation is that all the notes on the slide are in your books under the correct headings. Just a reminder before we get started that our driving question for the current topic is: how did the US freedom rides influence the civil rights movement in Australia? So we've already looked at the US freedom rides and what occurred in the United States. During our last lesson, I went through a presentation on exactly what happened, where the US freedom riders went, what happened to them when they went there, what they were trying to achieve, and all of that basic knowledge that you need to know about the US freedom rides. And in the rest of this video, we will look at the New South Wales freedom rides and how they are very similar to what happened in the US. And hopefully by the end of the video and by the end of the note taking, you would have a good idea of just how the US freedom rides influence civil rights movements in Australia. So your first subheading should be background to the Aboriginal freedom rides. And then I want you to take down these three notes. So, at the time of the freedom rides in 1965, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were denied rights by the governments of the day. State governments frequently dictated Aboriginal people's freedom of movement, personal finances, and child rearing practices. Child rearing means to raise children, so the way that Aboriginal people were allowed to raise their children was governed by the law. We've already touched on the stolen generation and what happened to them, and that is what child rearing practices would be referring to. That and other issues. Often Aboriginal people could not eat in restaurants, swim in public pools, or have access to education. So, when the term segregation is brought up, most people think about the United States and the segregation in schools and buses, which was the foundation of the freedom rides in the United States, which we discussed. While segregation was also happening here in Australia, it just wasn't legislated or as well known as the segregation in the United States. And so the aim of the New South Wales Freedom Riders, the Aboriginal Freedom Riders, was to kind of highlight this segregation. And as I go through the next few slides, you'll see that. Just while you're taking down those notes, I should also mention or explain that the state government frequently dictating Aboriginal rights, that has to do with the fact that the Commonwealth Constitution, so the constitution that governs the whole country of Australia, actually wasn't allowed to, didn't allow the federal government to create laws for Aboriginal people. So any law that had to do with Aboriginal people had to be created by state governments. If you still need more time to take down these notes, just pause the video. I will move on now. So who were the Aboriginal Freedom Riders? That should be your heading, subheading. So echoing the civil rights movement in the United States, the Freedom Ride was an inspiring journey through New South Wales from the 12th to the 26th of February 1965 to campaign for rights for Aboriginal people. A group of Aboriginal and non-Indigenous students from the University of Sydney travelled around towns by bus to expose discrimination, rally against the injustice of segregation, and give a voice to Aboriginal peoples. The Freedom Rides served as an inspiration for and a precursor to the 1967 referendum, where Australia overwhelmingly voted to allow Aboriginal people to enjoy the same rights and protections as all other Australians. So, on the previous slide, I mentioned that the reason state governments were able to create laws and dictate the lives of Aboriginal people was because the federal government was not constitutionally allowed to create laws for Aboriginal people. Well, the only way we can change the constitution is through referendums. And in 1967, so 2 years after the Freedom Rides, there was a referendum that asked Australians to allow the federal government to create laws for Aboriginal people. So it asked to allow to change the constitution to allow the government to create laws for Aboriginal people. So just take down those notes. Again, pause it if you haven't finished taking those notes yet. So what happened? Well, they modelled their journey on the US Freedom Rides. They would travel 2,300 kilometres from Sydney to far west New South Wales, and even parts of South Queensland. So they started here in Sydney, and they travelled west to as far as Walgett in West New South Wales, and they even travelled up to Queensland and then back to Sydney. So at Walgett in far west Queensland over here, they conducted a picket line holding posters outside segregated RSL clubs where Aboriginal servicemen and were not allowed to enter except on Anzac Day. So an RSL club is a club for retired servicemen, right? So the Retired Servicemen or Returning Servicemen League. And Aboriginal servicemen weren't allowed to enter these clubs except on Anzac Day. And that's what the Freedom Riders were trying to highlight when they went to Walgett. Their bus was run off the road by a white truck driver as they left. They were beaten and egged in Moree. So Moree is over here. While protesting segregated swimming pools. So the swimming pool at Moree wouldn't allow Aboriginal people inside. And when the Freedom Riders tried to enter, they were beaten and egged. So what's the legacy of the Aboriginal Freedom Riders? That's your subheading. Aboriginal Freedom Rides gained a lot of media attention and helped raise awareness of ATSI rights, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights. It highlighted the racial segregation and tensions present in the US were also present across Australia. It became an inspiration for future Aboriginal rights movements, and in particular the 1967 referendum, which I discussed already. So that's the main legacy of the Freedom Rides here in Australia. In our next lesson, we will have a closer look at these Freedom Rides and exactly what happened, and we'll also work on a comparison between the two. Thank you, and I'll see you next lesson.